This episode could save your marriage. Welcome to the Worship Leader Training Podcast. My name is Alex Infiedjan, and today we are talking about the vital topic of wise boundaries with the opposite sex in ministry. We've all heard of pastors or worship leaders who have run off with someone in their ministry, leaving their family and their church in total disarray. And maybe, sadly, it even happened to you. And unfortunately, infidelity happens all the time in the church, whether it's the congregants, but oftentimes even the staff. And over the years, especially lately, this topic has become increasingly important to me because I really, really want to be faithful to my family, to my wife, and to the Lord's calling on my life. And I'm sure you do too. But the topic of wise boundaries with the opposite gender is not something that's frequently discussed in the church. It's not taught in our seminaries. It's not trained to pastors when they first arrive at their ministry. But it is such an important topic, and I really believe that it will save marriages to talk about it. So I've decided to dedicate 2 episodes to this topic. So this month, we're going to be talking to Dr. Zack Carter, a professor at Taylor University who studies and teaches on the topic of marriage preservation, communication, and attraction between genders. And next month, we will have a roundtable discussion with 6 worship leaders from across the country on how they maintain wise boundaries in their interactions with the opposite sex. So we'll get into that interview in just a minute. If you remember, a few months ago, we started sharing sponsored products on our podcast, and I promised you that I would only bring you products that I loved, that I personally use, and that I really, truly felt would benefit you and your ministry. And that is the exact case with this month's sponsor, which is Planning Center. Most of you know about Planning Center, but if you don't, it's the most robust, easiest to use, highly effective tool that you could ever implement to plan and manage your worship services. I honestly don't know how I could function as a worship leader without it. I use Planning Center to schedule my teams, plan my worship sets, communicate with my team members, transpose songs, transpose chord charts, and house MP3s for my teams to reference. And something new that I recently discovered in Planning Center is that if you enter your chord charts in Planning Center's specific chord section, Planning Center will automatically transpose those chords to any key with one click. And that saves me so much time. So as I've been working with smaller churches and training smaller worship teams, I'm surprised how few of them are using Planning Center. It's free to try for 30 days with you don't have to enter a credit card or anything. And so I would encourage you, if you're not using Planning Center, use it. Plans start at $14 a month. You can check all of this out at planning.center. Planning.center. All right, so that's my recommended product for the month. Let's get into this incredible interview with Dr. Zack Carter. All right, hey everybody, I am here with Zack Carter. Thank you, Zack, so much for being on the podcast today.
Great to be here, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hey, Zack, tell us and our listeners exactly what it is that you research and teach at the university.
Sure. I'm out here in snowy Indiana, in the middle of a cornfield at a university called Taylor University. I teach in relationship communication, specifically relationship development, relationship management, relationship formation, all the how-tos, all the models of that. And primarily I focus a lot of my research on the development of relationships into good, healthy marriages. And a lot of my research up until now has examined married men and married women who unfortunately did not steward well social media communication. They didn't steward well text communication on the cell phone. And unfortunately harmed their marriage, oftentimes ending in divorce. So I have a passion for just looking at communication, not just online, not just in social media, but I've just found that in our pervasive world of social media and digital technology that they go hand in hand. And so I do a lot of research of verbal and nonverbal communication. So I look at different types of communication that we should do and the communication that we should not do in order to preserve the sanctity of a marriage relationship, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. And that's pretty much in a nutshell what I do with regards to research.
That's so fascinating, and it's so vital in this day and age where everyone is connected, and I can ping anybody I want, male or female, at any time of the day. I can look at photos of people on my team. It's just what you're doing is so important right now. So I'm super thrilled to have you on the podcast to talk about wise boundaries with the opposite sex. So let me ask you, Zack, what are some of the core findings that you're discovering in your research when it comes to the topic of attraction and technology?
Sure. Well, I would first start off with the addiction characteristic. We're seeing just this transfer of relationship communication to online. And we're seeing that, though. We're seeing people that are addicted, similar to, let's say, those who are alcoholics or those addicted to drugs. I think I looked the other day and it said over 50% of society checks their phone over 900 times a day, including social media, tweets, texts, and so forth. That's just looking at, your home screen just to see if you have any notifications. So, and by doing so, there's this illusion of intimacy that's occurring online. And that is, people feel so connected that it's taking the place of real world face-to-face interactions. That is, when people spend so much time online that when they go out to a coffee shop with friends or family or a restaurant, they're feeling alone. And this illusion of intimacy is leading oftentimes to what we're seeing now is affairs that are happening. And not all the time sexual face-to-face, but more so emotional. Because what's happening is people are developing these attachments online that have equal strength as face-to-face attachments. Though it takes longer to build those attachments online, it's very dangerous. So, for instance, somebody is on Facebook and private chats with somebody of the opposite sex. Let's say both of them are married. Over time, they usually start with trivial topics of conversation. They usually start talking about emotional topics. If one or both are having issues with their marriage, they'll talk about those issues, and then slowly it'll transition to typically sexual topics. And oftentimes it does lead eventually to face-to-face sexual affair. But what's very surprising is the detachment that's occurring whenever these affairs are happening is very interesting. I mean, not a good interesting, but a bad interesting, in that they are detaching from their families, their spouses, whenever they build these attachments in social media context. And it's very alarming. And this is another finding that when people are confronted with their interactions and social media, not just social media, this is cell phone text messaging. This is apps that people are going on, these dating apps now that are called dating apps, and they're hardly dating apps. They're more of, as they say, hookup apps, unfortunately. And people are alarmed that when they're confronted the interactions that they're having, the emotional, the sexual dialogue, these married people who've taken vows, and they're confronted by their spouses saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong, or they're confronted by a friend, hey, what you're doing is wrong. There's so much pushback, and it's because they're creating these attachments with these members of the opposite sex that overpower at times their relationships that they have with their spouses. Another finding is, we can look at social media like a grocery store. That is, you have endless aisles of options to peruse. So you have endless profiles to look at, and endless pictures and status updates and comments and tweets and so forth. That you have basically pick of a litter. So let's say you're having issues at home and you go online and you start seeing pictures from an ex from 10 years ago, and you see their pictures with their spouse and their kids, and they just look so happy, and they have these status updates that say, I love my wife, I love my husband. That right there is the theory of the grass is greener. You're looking online, you're looking at these pictures, you're reading these posts, and you're thinking their life is perfect, and you think back to your life and what you're going through on your day-to-day basis. And once again, it's detaching you from your spouse because you're constantly bombarded with these positive messages from your friends on social media. So those are just a few surprising conclusions. But
wow, yeah, that's covering a lot of the online aspect. But this risk of attraction happens online and in real life. And I wanted to hear some of your thoughts, because this is a podcast for worship leaders. I wanted to hear some of your thoughts as to how ministers are particularly at risk to become attracted to the opposite sex. Like, where are our danger zones? Why is it more dangerous for ministers? And if so, why?
I would say much more dangerous. I would say a pastor is in this position of authority that no other man has at any other institution, at any other corporation. They have a position that they hold this great influence over their flock. And let's say the opposite sex is out in the congregation. I'm just going to use an example of a pastor I heard of back in Virginia, where I came from. there was a woman out in the congregation, and she would go there weekly without her husband, mind you, without her husband, and hear this pastor speak on topics of relationships and good stewarding of the gospel and good stewarding of serving in the church. And he had actually spoken on relationships for about 3 weeks and talked about what it means to be a good man, stewarding well your family, stewarding well your wife, your children. And she's sitting there week in and week out hearing him, and she began to fall for him. She began to fall for this man who's standing behind a podium, who seems as if though he has it all together. He knows everything about relationships that she's not getting from home. She's not getting from home from her husband. Her husband's not attending church, and she is seeing it's a grass is greener theory. And so she is beginning to fall for him. And she actually looked him up on social media, and they became social media friends. It was Facebook, and I remember looking up at his account, and he had maybe 400 or so friends. So it wasn't overabundance. I mean, it was a large church, so he could have had thousands, but it seemed like he was very strategic in how many friends he had. And they basically it started off from what I heard after the affair had happened. It was a sexual affair, but it started off as just trivial topics of how's your day going. That was a great sermon on Sunday. How's your week? How's the kids? To how can I help you? What's going on at home? How's your husband? And she would say, my husband's not doing this, my husband's not doing that. And he started to fill this void of hers by communicating through text on Facebook, which seemed innocent enough. The pastor thought the entire time what he was doing was right, and that he was shepherding her well. He was, he was helping her emotionally, spiritually. He would say he's praying for her. They would pray through text. And send these messages back and forth. And this went on for about 4.5 weeks. And then they met up face to face. And from there, it spiraled downhill because they met up one-on-one. And it became more of a one-on-one relationship, more so than a stewardship of sorts. So you have this great responsibility to teach and preach the gospel to both men and women. And oftentimes, I think pastors feel as though they can treat both men and women the same equally. I remember one pastor who once told me, he said he had this one woman from church who kept friend requesting him on Facebook over and over again, and she started sending private messages. And finally, he just confronted her at church and was very forward with her and said, out of respect for my wife, I do not think it's appropriate that we be friends on Facebook based on some of the messages you sent me, based on some of the dialogue you sent to me. And so he was harsh with her, but he said something very profound. He said, I'm going to offend her before I offend my spouse. It is impossible interpersonally to give of ourselves 100% to our wife and 100% to another woman. At some point, there's going to be a sacrifice. So if you start giving to another woman relationally, emotionally, talking to her on social media, thinking as though you're being a good shepherd and leading her and discipling her, at some point, if you do that consistently, with either her or multiple women, there will be some disconnect with your wife. So it's tricky. It's a very tricky line to walk, as especially a pastor who is there as a counselor, as one who is supposed to take scripture and apply it to their congregation's respective lives and to help lead them and love them and guide them. And though I don't think it is wrong or inappropriate if a pastor is to meet with a member of the opposite sex and her husband, that is a completely different dynamic. There are opportunities to shepherd well the opposite sex, but one-on-one, I have seen in the research numerous times, especially by Christian researchers, that one-on-one opposite sex friendships are never appropriate.
That's so really helpful. So I was going to ask you this later, but I'd like you to answer it now. If we have to be very careful in pastoring and shepherding the opposite sex, what ways do you think are appropriate for worship leaders to show care for the females on their team?
Sure. I think it's imperative that there is a constant dialogue going on between the pastor and the opposite sex. I don't feel that interacting one-on-one is a bad thing, and I don't want that to be the message I'm saying here. I know a pastor specifically who went to a new church. The church had just been built, and he went into the office, and there were no windows on the door. And he said, "If I'm going to work here, we're going to put windows on the door." And they put windows on the door. And so when he interacts one-on-one with members of the opposite sex, like from his team, like, the worship leader, who's a female, there was that transparency, that visual transparency of the conversation going on. And so there are oftentimes discussions, though, that aren't all business related, that is, of the church. And that is where it can become a slippery slope. And that oftentimes people can feel this false sense of security that, okay, you're the pastor, nothing bad's going to happen. You're not going to say anything inappropriate. I'm not going to say anything appropriate. But that's just not true. There's many things that can go awry, unfortunately. And there are so many verbal and nonverbal nuances that can happen that you just cannot control. It's impossible to control as a human being. And so back to my notion that, you can't have one-on-one opposite sex friendships, that is why. But back to the question, there are many opportunities for the pastor to interact in group settings. I think that's imperative to keep conversation with members of his team with some type of group element. May that be designating maybe a room where there's a round table and the pastor meets in there with at least two other people. I'm a firm believer in living above reproach. I think as Christians, we have that responsibility to live above reproach, to go above and beyond what maybe society is doing to protect their relationships. And especially in the church context, where there's oftentimes a false sense of security, we have to be on our guard. There was another pastor in Virginia. I'm like bashing Virginia now, and I don't mean to do that, but there was another pastor in Virginia. He got a brand new motorcycle, and he brought it to church. And right after a church service, there was a large group outside, and a woman asked, "Hey, pastor, can I ride on the back?" And she got on the back. They rode around the block. He brought her back. She got off, and it was found out about 2 months later that they had an affair. And they asked the pastor, like, "When did you know? When did you know that you were going to have an affair?" Because he opened up about this. He was very transparent. He said, "Well, there were two moments. The first moment was the moment she touched me. That touch was electric, and it just electrified me. And I knew that I would pursue an affair with her. And the second moment was when I went home and added her on Facebook, when I added her to social media and started communicating with her. And that woman was actually a member of his staff, She worked in the children's department at that church. And so there's just this line, we have to live above reproach, and we can't fall into this false sense of security that a church is such, it is a holy place. It is a holy place to worship our God, but we are fallen men and women. And it is prideful to say that any place is a quote unquote sanctuary from the inappropriate dealings of men and women. Just as much evil can happen inside a church as outside of church with regards to not stewarding well communication with the opposite sex.
Should we suggest that the women of our teams be shepherded by another woman if they have issues or need help? Should we point them to our spouses, or how should we shepherd a woman on our team? Point them to other females?
Once again, live above reproach. Before an issue even arises, I would say assign somebody a mentor that is a female to have as a counselor, and that can be the mediator between the one young woman and the pastor. So for instance, you would have one woman of the staff, and she would have a mentor, and then there would be a pastor. And so if you'd ever have to meet with the pastor, you would meet with the mentor as well. So there'd be at least two women with the pastor meeting. And then that woman that's mentoring the other woman, she would have a mentor of herself. It depends on the size of the church, obviously, and how well we could do this. But for a smaller church, I would definitely just direct issues, relational issues, spiritual issues, emotional issues to the husband. And if they're single, if it's such a small church, that small of a church, their friend, an outside opposite sex member, there can never be a circumstance where it's like, oh, there's not enough women here. I think the pastor is just going to act as her mentor. They're one-on-one. They're going to go out to breakfast. They're going out to lunch to talk things over. They're going to talk in their office, because affairs don't just happen. There's oftentimes 8, 9, 10 steps in between. People think, it's at step 1. It's not. It's at step 10. It's how you guard between steps 1 and 10, and how you protect your marriage, how you establish guidelines for interacting with opposite sex. That's how you protect the marriage from it happening at step 10.
That's really good. Why don't you talk a little bit about those defensive tactics? How do we defend our marriage? What boundaries should we have in place to guard ourselves from attractions and affairs?
Sure. Establish firm guidelines with your spouse. Sit down, have a face-to-face conversation. These cannot be assumed guidelines, because one spouse may be thinking what's appropriate communication face-to-face and online and through text. They may think differently than their partner. It's very important for the husband and wife to sit down to establish these. I'd even encourage creating a Word document, something that you can reference down the road, because this needs to be revisited from time to time. Now, you don't want to become so obsessed with it that you place, obviously, your spouse, as an idol and become so possessive over their interactions. But if you know what you're supposed to do to respect your spouse, what the other one is expecting, you're more likely for that relationship to be protected. And this needs to be revisited, though, at least I'd say 2 to 3 times a year. So if you create a Word document, if you create these guidelines in a journal somewhere, sit down, and if new expectations or new guidelines come up, if you have some issues that you see, maybe you moved, you're in a new setting of some sort, new church, new school, or there's a new person in your life, there's somebody making advances online, or if you want to create a new guideline, that needs to be added to that. So it's a living, breathing document that you want to establish.
What are some of the guidelines? What would they be?
Well, transparency. So with technology, with phones and having locks on our iPhones and Androids and so forth, have access. The husband and wife should have access, should know the code. Share a code. Have the same code with regards to your phone. Have the same passwords for your emails, for your social media, if you have separate accounts, which, in my humble opinion, there should not be separate social media accounts. That's the drastic end of the spectrum. Now, I don't think it's wrong if you steward well, if you can steward well, if you are very cognizant of the friends that you have on social media, to have separate accounts. It is possible to do that. But it's when you have separate accounts and you have over 1,000 friends and you're friends with people from your past. No, that's when things go wrong. It's when you have a strategic amount of friends on your list. You're not friends with past exes. You're not friends with people at work who are, maybe interested in you. It's not people that maybe you might be interested in. It's being friends with very close, quote unquote, face-to-face friends and family when you're on social media and if you have separate accounts. Also, when having interactions, let's say through a text message or through an email, and let's say you have a separate email account, which I do encourage, joint private email accounts. And oftentimes we can't do that. I know my university account, it's for privacy. I cannot CC my spouse, but she does have access to my email accounts on my private computer at home. But when I do send emails from my private email, she is CC'd every time. She is CC'd in those correspondences. And so that transparency isn't just for her, but it's for me. I know that every word I'm speaking, she is witnessing as well. Providing her that transparency online, then for me, intrapersonally, as I say, myself, the way I perceive the world, it influences the way I interact face to face with women. So the more cognizant I am online of CCing her, allowing her to see things on my phone, see things on my email, my social media, et cetera, the more cognizant I am of when I'm away from her, when I'm at work, when I'm at the gym, when I'm at church, when I'm apart from her in any situation, when I'm at Starbucks, I have her more, quote unquote, by my side, because I'm more cognizant of her in the digital world. It's when we're not cognizant of our spouse online when things can go awry face to face. Because we get online, we can get a false sense of security of this is my space, this is my venue, my spouse does not need to be a part of it. That's when we can disconnect from our spouse, and then it will be seen in our face to face relationships with others. There's something called a backdoor situation. It's when things happen. I think you tell your spouse something that happened maybe two weeks ago. Let's say somebody advanced you at the gym and they asked you out, right? They bypassed your wedding ring and they just went straight forward, and you waited to tell your spouse. That's a backdoor scenario, in that you didn't tell them right away. You weren't transparent with them. You didn't come in the front door. The front door would have been telling them 2 weeks ago, 5 minutes after this opposite sex person asked you out, or had an advance, or did something inappropriate. Same thing online. We get into a false sense of security with our online conversations that they have no face-to-face implications, and that's false. That if somebody says something inappropriate to us on social media, or somebody tries to talk to us emotionally or sexually, or we do talk to somebody emotionally or sexually, and you're married, that we look at it as fake, as we can delete the conversation and the conversation never happened. And that's false, because you're harming your relationship. Your spouse may never find out, but you are detaching yourself from your spouse each time you have one of those conversations. And it's alarming. And that's, I do have a theory, because based on statistics, based on divorce court readings, for instance, 75% of divorce courts today, 75% state the word Facebook in the transcripts, the word Facebook. Whether it was addiction to it, or whether it was most of the time it's affairs that came forth from it. I do have a theory that in our congregations out there in the church, you look across on Sunday morning at all the couples out there, that I would say a large majority, I don't want to say a statistic, but a large majority has had some type of inappropriate conversation through text or social media. May it be the extreme of sexually explicit conversation, which there's more the minority. What I'm talking about is the emotional conversations that are happening online, that are happening through text, that are happening between congregation to congregation member, from congregation member to pastor, from pastor to congregation member, and they're not feeling as though it's infidelity. They're married and they're talking about the same topics with people they're not married with that they talk with their spouses, or they should talk to their spouses about.
That's really helpful. So there should be a differentiation between what we talk to our spouses with and what we feel free to talk with others about. Like our spouses should get the best of us and everyone else should get the rest of us.
Amen.
Right? That's a kind of cool little phrase
that.
there.
You should coin that.
You should take it and use it for your classes.
I like it.
Hey, so that's the defensive side. And I love what Craig Groeschel says about the defense. He says, why face a temptation tomorrow when you can eliminate it today? So now talk a little bit about the offensive side. Like what are some, the top 3 things that we can do to build into our marriages and protect them?
I'd first say, as maybe cliche as it sounds, but invest in your spouse. That is, invest in your spouse communication. They say one of the number one reason people divorce today is the lack of communication. People just aren't talking. We're not talking face to face. We're sitting on our phones at home. We're sitting on our iPads before we go to sleep, and we're not kissing our spouses goodnight. We're not praying over them. It's invest. It's just talk. It's communicate. It's making guidelines for when you're on your phone, when you're on the iPad, just maybe not having your phone in your room. You plug them in downstairs and you have an old-fashioned alarm clock. You take these drastic steps to invest in your spouse, and that causes you to be more cognizant of your spouse when you're apart from them, when you're interacting with the opposite sex, in turn helping to protect your relationship from a defensive perspective. But another way is
date night.
Not just date night. I'm a firm believer with once a week. I know with me and with we have once a week, just her and I, just on a Saturday, no matter what. But during the week, that's when people forget. I think the concept of date night is wonderful. It's terrific, especially in the Christian community. It's catching on. People are like, okay, once a week, no matter what, regardless of a Saturday or a Monday, we set out some time. Every day there should be a date time. A time where it's just you and your spouse, where you sit down, there's no technology, there's no children. Maybe it's after they go to bed if you do have children. Just a time where you just reflect with one another, love each other, hold each other, love each other according to each other's love language. A daily, this could be 20 minutes. I'm all for longer than that, but it could just be 20 minutes of just communicating, talking, words of affirmation, physical touch, gifts, whatever the love language is. Focus on that daily, because that's definitely what we're missing. I'd like to add that to that too. Like during the day, I think oftentimes I tell this to my students. I'm like, you think I just hate social media and text messaging, but it's just not true. I had the blessing of meeting my love of my life through eHarmony. So I have great admiration for online technology and the good it can have. So manipulate technology for good with your spouse. That is, bombard her with texts and bombard her with pictures and bombard him with texts and bombard him with pictures on a daily basis when you can't communicate vocally over the phone. Social media as well. If you have separate accounts, communicate with them, only communicate with them privately on social media or emails. Just let them know they're loved daily, not just once a week, but daily, so that you can show them that they're loved, but also it keeps you cognizant of them psychologically. And that's not that you're going to forget about your spouse, but the more cognizant you are, the more you're focusing on them, the less you're focusing on the opposite sex that you're talking to. We want to love them and interact with them and listen to what they say, but the less likely you will be thinking about, wow, they're attractive. Wow, I would love to be alone with them, to talk with them. Wow, I would love to become their Facebook friend or social, because a lot of times we do that today. People, when they first meet somebody, they think, oh, how can I become friends with them on social media so that I can send them a private message? If that's your first thought, then you're not investing in your spouse. You're not going on that offensive of bombarding her or him throughout the day with love and affirmation.
That's good. It's kind of like you really only have attention for one. So pick the spouse.
Exactly.
So a couple more questions here. What is the one common theme that you see in all affairs?
One common thing that I see in all affairs is that they all indicate, and I mean all that I have ever seen in my research at least, and in a lot of other research, but in mine specifically, is that they indicated that it could not happen to them before it happened. So that is, they always saw people who committed adultery or committed infidelity or talked inappropriately on social media or through text. They always said that that would never be them. And I've looked at a significant amount of folks, and the lie that people believe before they do it, it's pride. That is that it would never happen to them, because it can happen to me. I could get online right now and talk to somebody inappropriately. I can do it. We have to acknowledge that we can be these monsters. We can cheat on our spouse. When you acknowledge the truth, that is when you can set up guards. That is when you can inoculate yourself, right? It's like giving a flu shot to someone to prevent against the flu. You tell yourself, this can happen to me. You're going to set up parameters. You're going to go on the defensive. You're going to go on the offensive to protect your marriage. So the common theme across the board consistently is that folks, men and women, young and old, feel as though it can't happen to them, and thus they don't set up necessary safeguards before it happens to prevent those instances.
Wow. Take note, everybody. The people who thought it couldn't happen are the ones who did it. So we should have a humble heart. You know, I think about that because people, you and I, we got attracted to others many times before we were married, and putting a ring on our finger does not magically stop that process, right? Mm-hmm. It's not. The ring is just a ring. And so I don't know why we think it can't happen. It can happen, and it does. And so we have to set up guardrails. So what are some warning signs of potential attraction that people should be aware of if they're starting to notice certain feelings? What are some of the warning signs?
Sure. Nonverbal communication, nonverbals. Some people would call me an alarmist by saying what I'm about to say, but this is what we do unconsciously. Eye gaze, touch, body language. All three of these nonverbals can communicate desire. And we've all used them to our advantage and to our disadvantage, but to our advantage with regards to, let's say, the opposite sex. When you're younger and you're trying to court someone, you may have done this with your spouse. You catch eye contact with them, right? And you look away, and then you look back to see if she's looking or he's looking, and then you catch eye contact again, and you go and talk. I mean, eye contact, the reason that we are such good communicators, I mean, God designed us physiologically, like that white in our eyes, that white sclera. Most animals don't have that, right? They're predators, they're prey. They're not meant to communicate visually, but we are. And so when we catch this white sclera, we see communication. So when you're at work, when you're at the gym, eye contact is the first line of either, hey, come talk to me, or hey, stay away. And being mindful of that, being mindful of not to flirt with our eyes, being mindful of touch. Touch is electric. As I indicated, that pastor who, a member of his staff, got on the back of a motorcycle, and right when she touched him, he knew that he would commit an affair. Not to say that every person you touch you're going to have an affair with, but it's that consistent touch. It's that subtle touch, right? It's why they say babies must be touched when they're at a certain age in order to grow, literally grow. And many of us, our love language is touch. So if your love language is touch, and you're being touched often at work, and you're finding yourselves being attracted to that person touching you, you need to find a larger proximity between you and them each time you speak.
Yeah, and even high fives and fist bumps are kind of what I try to do with the females on my team,
I like that. Yeah. I like that. That's brilliant. It's brilliant. It communicates, hey, we're part of a team. Hey, I love you as a sister in Christ, but I'm not going any further than that. And it doesn't only guard your heart, but it guards their heart. Nonverbals are key. Online, there is a lack of nonverbals. That's why text is just so dangerous. There are two types of nonverbals online, and that is time and emoticons. So emojis were created to help convey part of the message. So all those smiley faces you received, the chocolate sherbet that looks like poop. I don't know which one it is though. Different type of emojis that communicate were created, but also time, and that the more you spend talking with somebody online on social media, if you find yourself talking for 2, 3, 4 hours with the opposite sex on Facebook, that's a red flag. I mean, the nuclear power plant is about to self-destruct, and you need to get out. I mean, that is time you are creating emotions. You're creating feelings inside either yourself or the other. You may be sitting there perfectly content on the other side of that computer interaction and feeling that, oh, I'm helping them. You don't have any attachment whatsoever. But what are they feeling? Right? You can't speak to their heart. You can't speak to they are attaching. So the time you spend in talking with somebody on social media can communicate desires emotionally and sexually.
That gives a good point of like, we really need to be careful of the encouragement that we give to the females, or if you're a female listener, to the opposite, to like, especially though, like females take encouragement and care differently, I think, than guys do. And so if you're texting encouragement or emailing encouragement to a female team member, I guess I'm trying to say a couple of things. One is we have to be very sensitive to our nonverbal communication, to like really have borders and guards up. Like, I don't care if girls who aren't my wife think I'm a little bit stiff. I don't care. Mm-hmm. Like they should. But yeah, so the nonverbal thing we have to be aware of, but also because texting and emails, you can't read into that. We probably shouldn't encourage the opposite gender via those channels because they can be misconstrued.
Oh no, I agree with you 100%. And definitely in a church setting, and you have staff under you and they're the opposite sex, and they may be communicating with you if you're a pastor to some degree through text, I would immediately cut bait. If you want to communicate to the opposite sex that you're only available through a phone call, if somebody texts you of the opposite sex, pick up the phone and call them immediately. You don't need to acknowledge, hey, I'm not going to text you because it's not right. And you're welcome to say, hey, out of respect for my spouse, I'm just going to talk to you on the phone. You're welcome to say that. But indirectly, if you do that, that's going to communicate to them, hey, we're going to keep this relationship between us just over the phone or face to face. Because when you take things to text, when you take things to solely email or Facebook, you are basically, you can look at social media or text messaging as locking yourself in a private room with no windows, locks on either side of the door. You're asking for trouble.
Yeah. So let's go to the person who maybe is listening and they're realizing that they're in dangerous territory, or worse, that they've crossed the line, whether it's an emotional affair or a physical affair. What advice would you give to someone who has realized that they're in that space?
Cut bait and run. More so than that, we have a responsibility to our spouses to be transparent. We have a responsibility to ask forgiveness, to repent from our sin. I don't care if it's an emotional text messaging back and forth, or if you're having sex with them at your house when your spouse is gone. Either way, you need to ask, obviously forgiveness from the Lord first. You need to repent, move, and go to your spouse though and have an honest dialogue, because even if you haven't committed sexual adultery, you've committed adultery of the heart by disclosing communications on Facebook that typically are meant for your spouse. And you may feel as though I don't need to tell my spouse because I think it's just going to hurt them. That's selfish. That's a selfish reason to not want to go before your spouse to tell them what you've done wrong. The inner issues, though, of the self that can happen are just as damaging. That is, if you continue in your sin, you continue having these types of conversations, you say, "Oh, I'm not hurting my spouse. I'm they're not going to find out." You're hurting them because you're disconnecting yourself from them. And so if you're having one-on-one private text messaging with somebody, let's say on your church staff or somebody in your congregation, or if you're on social media, and it's not hurting my spouse, as I said in the beginning, it's impossible to keep up that emotional affair that you're having and be able to go home at night and look at your wife the same way that you did when you first married them. It's impossible to disconnect mentally when you are connecting with multiple people.
Yeah, so cut the other person out. Basically, unfriend them on Facebook, tell them you can't text them anymore, you can't talk to them anymore. You might even have to get a different job or move to a different church if it's at that level. But you're saying cut bait, like cut the cord.
Yes, there is nothing you shouldn't be willing to do to preserve the sanctity of your marriage. Any of that, quitting your job, getting off social media, unfriending people, in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of eternity, you unfriending somebody, it's not even a drop in the pond. I mean, I recommend blocking people too. People that you can see, if you're one of those people that can break down abstraction are really good, and let's say somebody from your past adds you on Facebook and it's somebody that you were really interested in, block them immediately. Just block, because then it's out of sight, it's out of mind. They can't send you a private message saying, hey, why didn't you accept my friend request? And it discourages any conversation from beginning.
The only way that somebody would be fighting what we're telling them to do right now is if they wanted to continue in sin.
Yes, that's precisely it.
Which would be sad. And I pray that none of our listeners are in that spot. Gosh, Zack, this has been, I feel like I could talk to you for 2 hours. But do you have any final words for our listeners?
I think it would be just what you said. If you are currently, if you're just a regular 9-to-5er, if you're a pastor, if you're a person in the congregation, if you don't go to church, if you're having communication with the opposite sex, if you're and you're married and you're doing this on Facebook, on text, and you're feeling emotionally connected to them, similarly to how you were once connected with your spouse, trust me when I say there is devastation on the horizon. It may not be, your marriage may not end, but you're not going to have a happy marriage, because even though your spouse may never find out, you will never be fully satisfied internally. There will always be a disconnect from you and your spouse till you can disconnect from the sin that you're in.
Zack, this has probably struck a chord with many people, and if they want to stay in touch with you or reach out to you, what would be some ways online that they can get to you?
Well, not surprisingly, I'm actually currently not on social media. And that's something my fiance and I are still trying to work out what type of social media we're going to have, if we're going to have it. I would say university email probably would be the most appropriate.
So if they can go to tayloruniversity.edu and find your professor bio there.
Yep. On the communication department, the faculty page. Yep. I have a big old smiling, goofy picture and my email right below it. So.
Awesome. Zack, thank you so much for your time. We treasure it, and it has been a blessing to many people.
Thank you for the opportunity, Alex. I appreciate it.
Wow. I hope you will take action on the content of this episode. I hope it won't just leave your playlist and not make a difference, but I would encourage you, send it to your spouse, listen to it with your spouse, sit down and talk to your spouse, and send it to every ministry leader that you know, because we're all in danger of this. Send it also to someone who you think may be on the edge of an inappropriate relationship. I just pray that God would use this content in a really powerful way in your life. So thanks for listening. Again, be sure to check out our recommended product planning center at planning.center, and I'll see you next month for our worship leader roundtable discussion of wise boundaries with the opposite sex. God bless you guys. Talk to you later.